December 1944. The snow-covered fields near Bastogne, Belgium. A Sherman tank from the 4th Armoured Division rolled forward at 15 miles per hour, its 76mm gun traversing left, as the gunner tracked a German Panther tank positioned 800 meters away. The Sherman's commander didn't order a halt. Instead, he called fire while the tank was still moving. The gun roared. The shell struck the Panther's side armor and penetrated. Flames erupted from the German tank's engine deck. The entire engagement lasted 12 seconds from target acquisition to kill. The Panther crew never got a shot off because they were still bringing their tank to a complete stop, lowering their gun, and settling their aim when the American shell arrived. This scene repeated itself thousands of times across France, Belgium, and Germany in 1944 and 1945. American tankers were doing something that defied conventional armored warfare doctrine of the era. They were firing accurately while their tanks were moving. German, British, and Soviet tank doctrine all emphasized the same principle. Stop, aim carefully, fire, then move. The Americans had discovered something revolutionary. In many situations, an adequate hit right now was better than a perfect hit several seconds from now. To understand why this represented such a radical departure, you need to understand the state of tank gunnery in the early 1940 seconds. Every army knew that firing a tank gun while moving was wildly inaccurate. The suspension bounced, the gun mount swayed, the entire hull pitched and rolled over uneven ground. Hitting anything smaller than a building at ranges beyond 200 meters while moving was considered basically impossible. German doctrine, refined through years of development and combat experience, treated the tank as a mobile gun platform that stopped to fire. Panzer crews trained extensively in a specific sequence: identify target, maneuver to firing position, halt the tank completely, allow the suspension to settle for 2 to 3 seconds, aim precisely using the excellent German optics, fire, observe the hit, and then either fire again or move to a new position. This doctrine worked brilliantly when German tanks had the initiative and could choose their engagements. A Tiger or Panther in a prepared ambush position with a clear field of fire was devastatingly effective. German tanks had superior optics, superior guns at long range, and crews trained to make that critical first shot count. When everything went according to plan, German armor dominated the battlefield. Soviet doctrine was similar. Soviet tanks stopped to fire, though Soviet crews were generally less trained in precise gunnery than their German counterparts. The Soviets compensated with massive numerical superiority and aggressive tactics, but the fundamental approach remained: stop, shoot, move. British doctrine also emphasized careful, deliberate gunnery from stationary positions. British tanks had excellent gun stabilization systems by 1943, but British doctrine hadn't yet fully incorporated the tactical implications. British crews were trained to use the stabilization primarily to keep the gun on target while moving to a firing position, then halt to take the actual shot. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Americans had access to the same stabilization technology as the British. In fact, American tanks used Westinghouse gyrostabilizers that were even more advanced. But the Americans did something different. They developed an entire tactical doctrine around firing while moving. This didn't happen by accident. It emerged from a combination of technological capability, tactical necessity, and a fundamentally different approach to armored warfare. The story begins in 1940, when the US Army, observing the German blitzkrieg through France, realized it desperately needed modern tanks. American tank development was years behind European powers. The M3 Lee medium tank, rushed into production in 1941, was already obsolete before it entered service, with its main gun mounted in a hull sponson rather than a rotating turret. The M4 Sherman medium tank, which entered production in early 1942, represented a dramatic improvement. It featured a fully rotating turret with a 75mm gun, decent armor for its time, and something that would prove more important than anyone initially realized: a gyrostabilizer for the main gun. The Westinghouse stabilizer in the Sherman was a complex hydraulic system that used a gyroscope to detect the gun's movement and hydraulic actuators to counteract that movement, keeping the gun pointed at the same spot, even as the tank hull pitched and rolled over rough terrain. The system could stabilize in the vertical plane, preventing the gun from bouncing up and down as the tank moved. British tanks had similar systems. The British had actually pioneered tank gun stabilization in the late 1930s. But there was a critical difference in how the two armies approached this technology. The British viewed stabilization primarily as a way to keep the gun approximately on target during movement, allowing the gunner to quickly engage once the tank halted. British gunnery training still emphasized firing from a complete stop. The stabilizer was seen as a convenience feature, not a fundamental game-changer. American tank doctrine writers saw something different. They recognized that if the stabilizer could keep the gun steady enough to maintain aim while moving, it might be steady enough to actually fire while moving. Not with sniper precision, but with combat accuracy at typical engagement ranges. The implications were enormous. A tank that could fire effectively while moving had a massive tactical advantage. It could engage targets faster. It could shoot while advancing or retreating, never presenting a stationary target. It could maintain momentum during an assault instead of stopping repeatedly. Most importantly, it could get rounds downrange before the enemy completed their firing sequence. But doctrine and reality often diverge. When American tank crews first deployed to North Africa in late 1942, they had limited training and no combat experience. The stabilizer systems were temperamental and frequently malfunctioned in desert conditions. Sand got into everything. Crews didn't fully trust the equipment. Many gunners actually turned off the stabilizer and fought using conventional stop-and-shoot tactics. The disastrous American debut at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 showed how much the inexperienced American tankers had to learn. German Panzers, particularly Tigers and Panzer IVs with long 75mm guns, destroyed American tanks at ranges where the Sherman's 75mm gun was ineffective. German crews with years of combat experience outfought green American tankers who hadn't yet developed effective tactics, but the Americans learned fast. By the time of the Sicily invasion in July 1943 and the Italian campaign that followed, American tank crews were becoming more proficient. They began to understand their equipment better and developed tactics that played to their strengths rather than trying to match German methods. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who would later command all American armor in Europe and eventually become Army Chief of Staff, was among the officers who recognized that American tanks needed different tactics than German panzers. The Sherman couldn't win a stand-up gunnery duel with a Tiger or Panther at long range. American armor was thinner. The 75mm gun lacked penetrating power against heavy German armor at distance. But the Sherman had advantages: better reliability, better crew ergonomics, faster turret traverse, better visibility, and that gyro stabilizer. American doctrine began emphasizing speed and maneuver over stationary gunnery duels. Get close, move fast, hit from the flank, keep the enemy off balance. The stabilizer became central to this doctrine. Crews began practicing firing while moving. Not at long range, the stabilizer wasn't accurate enough for 1,500-meter shots while rolling over rough ground. But at medium ranges of 400 to 800 meters, with practice, gunners could achieve combat-effective accuracy while moving at 10 to 15 miles per hour. Training methods evolved rapidly. Back in the United States, armor schools began incorporating moving fire into basic gunnery training. New crews arriving in Europe in 1944 had spent hundreds of hours practicing the technique. They learned to feel the rhythm of their tank's movement, to time shots for the split second when the suspension reached the bottom of a dip or the top of a rise, minimizing vertical motion. Experienced gunners developed an almost instinctive sense of when to fire. They learned to lead moving targets while their own tank was moving, solving a complex geometric problem through practice and muscle memory rather than calculation. They learned which speeds and terrains allowed accurate fire and which required slowing down. The 76mm gun, introduced on later Sherman variants in 1944, made this doctrine even more effective. The 76mm had better penetration than the 75mm, allowing Shermans to threaten German heavy tanks from the front at reasonable ranges. Combined with firing while moving, American tanks could now engage and destroy Panthers and even Tigers before the German tanks completed their stop-aim-fire sequence. By the Normandy invasion in June 1944, firing on the move had become standard American tactical doctrine. Tank commanders were trained to recognize situations where mobility fire was advantageous and situations where a conventional stop-and-shoot approach was better. Generally, mobility fire was preferred when the enemy was unaware or just becoming aware of the American tank's presence. Speed of engagement mattered more than precision. The American tank needed to maintain momentum during an assault. The tactical situation required constant movement to avoid enemy fire. The range was medium, 400 to 800 meters, rather than long or very short. Conversely, American crews would still halt to fire when precision was critical, when engaging at very long range, when firing from a prepared defensive position, or when the tactical situation allowed careful aim. This flexibility, the ability to choose between mobility fire and stationary fire based on circumstances, gave American tank units a tactical versatility that German armor lacked. German crews were locked into a doctrine that required stationary fire. Their training, their equipment, and their tactical procedures all assumed the tank would halt before firing. The technical capability to fire while moving was only half the equation. The tactical implementation of this capability required a complete reimagining of how tanks fought. Inside a Sherman tank, the process of firing, while moving, involved precise coordination among the five-man crew. The driver, sitting in the front left hull position, maintained steady speed and tried to choose the smoothest path. Sudden speed changes or sharp turns disrupted the gunner's aim. Experienced drivers learned to call out obstacles bump ahead or dip in 10 yards, giving the gunner advance warning. The assistant driver, in the front right hull position, operated the hull-mounted 30 caliber machine gun and served as extra eyes. In combat, he watched for infantry threats and targets on the right side that the gunner and commander might miss. The gunner, seated on the right side of the turret, had the most demanding job during mobility fire. He gripped the gun control handles, his right hand on the trigger, his left on the traverse control. His face pressed against the rubber eyepiece of the M71 series periscopic sight. Through that sight, he could see a magnified view of the target area with crosshairs marking the aim point. But that view bounced and swayed constantly as the tank moved. The gyrostabilizer reduced the bouncing but didn't eliminate it. The gunner had to track the target continuously, making constant tiny adjustments to keep the crosshairs on or near the target. The key skill was learning the tank's motion pattern. Every Sherman had slightly different suspension characteristics based on wear, terrain, and speed. The gunner needed to develop an intuitive feel for his specific tank's rhythm. Good gunners could predict when the tank would bounce and when the suspension would momentarily settle. The loader, on the left side of the turret, had to maintain his footing while the tank pitched and rolled, keep track of ammunition types, and slam 15 to 20-pound shells into the breech as quickly as possible. Loading while moving was physically demanding and potentially dangerous. A violent bounce could slam a loader against the turret wall or trap his hand in the breech. The tank commander, standing in the turret behind the gunner, orchestrated everything. He identified targets, decided whether to fire on the move or halt, gave range estimates, designated ammunition types, and maintained situational awareness. A good tank commander could track multiple threats simultaneously and prioritize engagement sequence. The commander's call of tank 800, traverse left, steady, told the entire crew. Enemy tank, approximately 800 meters range. Gunner should traverse left to acquire, driver should maintain steady speed. The gunner would respond, identified, when he acquired the target through his sight. The commander would then call fire or up, and the gunner would squeeze the trigger. The entire sequence, from target identification to shot fired, could happen in 5 to 8 seconds while the Sherman was moving. A German tank crew, following conventional doctrine, needed 8 to 12 seconds minimum, because they had to bring the tank to a complete stop, let the suspension settle, and then aim, precisely. That 3 to 6 second difference was often the difference between killing and being killed. American crews discovered other advantages to firing while moving. A moving tank presented a harder target for enemy guns. German gunners trained extensively to hit stationary or slowly moving targets at long range, but hitting a tank moving at 15 miles per hour at 600 meters was significantly more difficult. Even if the German gunner aimed perfectly, the time of flight meant the shell might arrive where the Sherman had been, not where it was. Psychological factors mattered too. German tank commanders expected enemy tanks to stop before firing. When a Sherman kept rolling forward while shooting, it disrupted German tactical expectations. Panzer crews suddenly faced a tank that wasn't following the rules of armoured combat as they understood them. After-action reports from late 1944 and early 1945 contain numerous accounts of German tanks being destroyed by American mobility fire. A typical engagement from the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 illustrates the tactical advantage. A platoon of 4 Sherman 76mm tanks from the 9th Armoured Division was advancing through a village when the lead tank commander spotted a Panther 700 meters ahead, partially concealed behind a building. The Panther crew had heard the Shermans approaching and was turning to engage. The American platoon leader immediately ordered, "Line formation, mobility fire, keep moving." The 4 Shermans spread out and accelerated to about 12 miles per hour, all guns traversing toward the Panther. The Panther commander, seeing 4 Shermans charging toward him while spreading out, had to make an instant decision: which tank to engage first. He chose the leftmost Sherman. His gunner began the engagement sequence: halt the tank, settle the gun, acquire the target precisely. This took approximately 6 seconds, but before the Panther could fire, all 4 Shermans had fired while moving. 3 shots missed. 1 struck the Panthers, the turret side armor, and penetrated. The Panther caught fire immediately. The engagement was over in 9 seconds. If the Shermans had followed conventional doctrine, stopping to fire the Panther would have gotten off at least 1 shot, probably destroying the lead Sherman before being engaged by the others. The aggressive mobility fire eliminated that possibility. The Germans noticed this American tactical pattern and tried to develop countermeasures. German tank commanders were ordered to prioritize targets showing aggressive movement. If multiple enemy tanks appeared, shoot the ones advancing first. Some German units began pre-aiming at likely approach routes, trying to catch American tanks in established kill zones where the long-range gunnery advantage offset American mobility. But these countermeasures had limited effectiveness because American tank doctrine emphasized flexibility. American tank commanders were trained to recognize prepared German positions and adapt tactics accordingly. If approaching a German defensive line, American tanks would use hull-down positions, smoke, artillery support, and careful maneuvering rather than charging directly into a kill zone. The mobility fire doctrine worked best in fluid situations, meeting engagements, pursuits, exploitation of breakthroughs, and urban combat. In these situations, American tanks consistently achieved favorable kill ratios, despite facing technically superior German armor. The effectiveness of firing while moving varied significantly based on range and circumstances. At very close ranges, under 300 meters, mobility fire was devastatingly effective. The stabilizer worked well, hit probability was high, and the psychological impact of a tank charging while shooting was enormous. American tanks excelled in close-range combat in towns and forests, where long-range German gunnery advantages didn't apply. At medium ranges of 400 to 800 meters, mobility fire was combat effective, but not perfect. Hit probability while moving was perhaps 20–30% for a trained crew under good conditions, compared to 60–70% from a halt. But the speed advantage often allowed 2 to 3 shots while moving before the enemy could fire once from a stop. The math favored mobility fire. At long ranges beyond 1,000 meters, mobility fire became impractical. The stabilizer couldn't compensate enough for the distance. American crews would halt for long-range shots, using their good optics and taking time to aim carefully. Weather and terrain significantly affected mobility fire effectiveness. On smooth roads or firm ground, gunners could achieve good accuracy. On rough terrain or muddy fields, the tank's violent pitching made accurate fire nearly impossible. Snow and ice reduced traction, making smooth driving difficult. Rain and fog obscured visibility, negating the advantage of rapid engagement. Experienced crews learned to read terrain and adjust tactics accordingly. Attacking across a ploughed field? Probably better. To advance to a good position and then halt to fire. Attacking down a paved road? Mobility fire all the way. The introduction of the 76mm gun in mid-1944 enhanced mobility fire effectiveness considerably. The 76mm M1 gun had much better armor penetration than the 75mm, allowing frontal penetrations of Panther tanks at reasonable ranges. This meant American tanks no longer had to maneuver for flank shots before engaging. They could fire from any angle while moving. The 76mm also had better muzzle velocity, meaning flatter trajectory, and less need to compensate for range estimation errors. A gunner who estimated 700 meters when the actual range was 800 meters would still get a near miss with the flat-shooting 76mm, possibly close enough for a second shot correction. The slower 75mm had more pronounced trajectory curve, making range estimation more critical. By early 1945, American armored divisions had refined mobility fire into a comprehensive tactical system. Tank platoon leaders, choreographed engagements like conductors leading an orchestra. 4 or 5 tanks would advance in formation, all firing while moving, creating a rolling barrage that saturated the target area. Even if individual hit probability was modest, 5 tanks firing while advancing generated enough accurate fire to suppress or destroy most targets before they could respond effectively. German tanks facing this coordinated mobility assault often died before firing a shot, or fired wildly under pressure and missed. The Germans never developed an effective counter to this American tactical approach because they couldn't. German tanks lacked effective gun stabilization. The rare German attempts to fire while moving were wildly inaccurate. German doctrine and training were built around precise, careful gunnery from stationary positions. Changing that doctrine army-wide would have required years of training and equipment modifications that Germany didn't have time or resources to implement by 1944. The popular narrative of Sherman tanks versus German armor often focuses on technical specifications: thinner armor, less powerful guns, inferior protection. The Sherman becomes the underdog tank that survived through numbers alone, drowning German panzers in a flood of expendable American steel. This narrative is both true and misleading. Yes, Sherman armor was thinner than Tiger or Panther armor. Yes, the 75mm gun couldn't penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at typical combat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Ranges. Yes, American tank losses in 1944–45 were substantial, but focusing exclusively on technical specifications misses the crucial point. The Americans had developed tactics that negated many of the German technical advantages. The fire-while-moving doctrine didn't make the Sherman equal to the Tiger or Panther on paper. It made the Sherman more effective, actual combat conditions. And in war, what matters is combat effectiveness, not technical specifications. Statistical analysis of tank engagements in Northwest Europe from June 1944 to May 1945 reveals surprising patterns. When American and German armor met in fluid, mobile combat meeting engagements, pursuits, exploitation phases, American tanks achieved roughly even kill ratios, despite facing technically superior German vehicles. The mobility fire doctrine proved its worth. In static defensive situations where German tanks could choose firing positions and engage at long range, German armor maintained significant advantages. A Tiger in a prepared position at 1,500 meters was still nearly invincible to frontal attack by Shermans. German long-range gunnery remained superior throughout the war, but by late 1944, the Germans were increasingly forced into defensive operations with limited mobility due to fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and air attack. The situations where German armor excelled became progressively rarer. Meanwhile, American tactical advantages in mobile warfare became more relevant as Allied armies pursued retreating German forces across France and into Germany. Individual accounts from American tank commanders reveal how the doctrine functioned in practice. Captain James Burt of the 66th Armored Regiment earned the Medal of Honor for his actions near Aachen, Germany in October 1944. His citation describes him repeatedly engaging German armor and anti-tank guns while moving, destroying multiple targets and leading his company in a successful assault. His aggressive use of mobility fire was specifically noted as key to the action's success. Sergeant Lafayette Poole of the 3rd Armored Division became one of the most successful American tank commanders of the war, credited with destroying 12 German tanks and over 250 other vehicles. His preferred tactic was rapid maneuver combined with mobility fire, getting close enough that the Sherman's gun became effective while using speed and aggression to disrupt German firing sequences. These weren't exceptional cases, but rather exemplars of doctrine applied skillfully. Thousands of American tank commanders used the same basic approaches with varying degrees of success. The German perspective on American armor tactics comes through in captured documents and post-war interviews. German tank commanders consistently noted the aggressiveness of American armor attacks and the unusual American tendency to fire while moving. Multiple German after-action reports describe American tanks advancing while shooting wildly, though the shooting was more controlled than German observers realized. Oberst Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment, wrote in his memoirs about facing American armor in Normandy. The American tanks came forward shooting continuously. They did not fight in the methodical way we expected. They seemed willing to accept losses to close the range quickly. Once they were within 500 meters, their numbers and aggression usually prevailed. The Germans also recognized the coordination of American combined arms. American tanks advancing with infantry support, artillery on call, and air superiority overhead presented a completely different challenge than meeting a similar number of Soviet tanks. The Soviets had numbers, but often lacked coordination. The Americans had both numbers and systematic combined arms integration. Technical evolution continued throughout the war. By 1945, American industry had developed the T-26E3 Pershing heavy tank with a 90mm gun and heavier armor, theoretically making it equal to German heavy tanks. But the Pershing arrived too late and in too few numbers to significantly impact the war. The vast majority of American tank combat through war's end involved Sherman variants. What did matter was continuous improvement of the Sherman itself. Later models had better armor, better guns, better ammunition, and refined stabilizer systems. The Sherman Jumbo variant had much thicker armor, though only 254 were built. The 76mm gun became standard on new production. High-velocity armor-piercing ammunition improved penetration dramatically. By early 1945, a late-production Sherman 76mm with HVAP ammunition could penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at 600 meters under favorable conditions. This was still not as good as a Tiger or Panther's capabilities, but it was combat adequate, especially when combined with mobility fire doctrine. The British, who operated thousands of American-supplied Shermans alongside their own designs, generally didn't adopt American mobility fire tactics to the same degree. British doctrine remained more conservative, emphasizing careful gunnery from stationary or slow-moving positions. British crews used the stabilizer primarily to maintain aim while positioning for a shot, then halted to fire. This difference in doctrinal application showed in combat results. American Sherman units generally achieved better combat effectiveness than British Sherman units facing similar German opposition, despite using essentially identical equipment. The difference wasn't the tank, it was how the tank was employed. The Soviets received thousands of Shermans through Lend-Lease and appreciated their reliability and crew ergonomics compared to Soviet designs. But Soviet tactical doctrine didn't emphasize the kind of fire while moving tactics the Americans had developed. Soviet armor doctrine stressed mass, shock action, and aggressive advance, but typically with tanks halting to fire. The stabilizer capability went largely unutilized in Soviet service. After the war, the American fire while moving doctrine became the foundation for US armor tactics going forward. The M26 Pershing, M46 Patton, and subsequent American tank designs all featured increasingly sophisticated stabilization systems. By the 1960 seconds, American tanks had full two-axis stabilization, allowing accurate fire while moving cross-country at high speed. The doctrine developed with the Sherman in 1943–45 carried forward into the Cold War and remains central to American armor employment today. Modern American tanks can engage and destroy targets at 2,000+ meters while moving at 30 miles per hour over rough terrain, a capability that traces directly back to those Sherman crews in Normandy who discovered they could hit Panthers while rolling forward at 15 miles per hour. The Germans never developed equivalent capability during World War II. Post-war German tank designers, working for NATO armies in the Cold War, studied American stabilization technology and mobility fire doctrine carefully. The Leopard 1 and Leopard 2 tanks featured excellent stabilization, and German armor doctrine evolved to incorporate fire while moving tactics based on the American model. The final assessment of Sherman versus Tiger-Panther matchups must consider the complete tactical picture, not just armor, thickness, and gun penetration tables. The Sherman was not the equal of German heavy tanks in a stationary gunnery duel at long range, but that specific situation represented only a fraction of actual combat engagements. In the fluid, chaotic, close-range combat that characterized much of the fighting in 1944–45, the Sherman's advantages in reliability, crew ergonomics, speed, and fire, while moving capability often proved more valuable than the Tiger's thicker armor and more powerful gun. The Tiger might kill a Sherman in a carefully arranged ambush, but it might also never make it to the ambush position due to mechanical breakdown, or get caught by multiple Shermans in a meeting engagement and die before firing a shot. The American approach represented a fundamental difference in military philosophy. The Germans sought technical perfection, building the best tank possible and expecting tactics to extract maximum performance. The Americans sought practical effectiveness, building a good enough tank that could be produced in quantity and developing tactics that maximized the tank's actual capabilities. Neither approach was objectively superior in all circumstances, but in the specific circumstances of the Western Front in 1944–45 with Allied air superiority, overwhelming industrial capacity, and campaigns of maneuver deep into Germany, the American approach proved more effective. The Sherman crews who mastered fire while moving tactics earned their victory not through superior equipment, but through superior employment of adequate equipment. They took a medium tank with a gyrostabilizer and transformed it into a weapon system that could defeat technically superior opponents by fighting smarter rather than harder. The legend of Sherman tanks charging German positions while firing, of Tigers destroyed before they could return fire, of American aggression overwhelming German technical sophistication. This legend is grounded in tactical reality. The Americans discovered that the way you fight matters as much as what you fight with. They developed a doctrine that played to their strengths and exploited enemy weaknesses. When those American tankers near Bastogne killed a Panther before it could fire, they weren't defying the laws of armored warfare. They were applying a new set of laws that they themselves had written, laws that recognized speed of engagement could matter more than precision of aim, that adequate hits delivered quickly beat perfect hits delivered slowly, and that the tank which fires effectively first usually wins, regardless of whose armor is thicker. The fire while moving doctrine represented one of the most significant tactical innovations in armored warfare during World War II. It changed how tanks fought and influenced armor doctrine for decades afterward. The Americans didn't build better tanks than the Germans, they built adequate tanks and found better ways to use them. In the end, that proved more than enough. The technical capability to fire while moving and the tactical doctrine to employ it effectively would have meant nothing without the crews who made it work. The American advantage in mobility fire ultimately came down to training, crew coordination, and an organizational culture that encouraged innovation from the bottom up. American tank crew training in 1943–44 was comprehensive but rushed. The United States needed to field armored divisions quickly to support operations in Europe and the Pacific. Training cycles that ideally would have taken a year were compressed into 6 to 8 months. Yet within those abbreviated programs, American armor schools managed to instill fundamental skills that proved decisive in combat. Fort Knox, Kentucky served as the primary armor training center. Recruits arriving there faced an intensive curriculum covering everything from basic vehicle maintenance to advanced gunnery. But the American training philosophy differed fundamentally from German approaches in one critical aspect. American instructors emphasized initiative and problem-solving over rote execution of procedures. German tank training was superb in technical fundamentals. German crews learned their vehicles inside and out, practiced precise gunnery endlessly, and drilled tactical procedures until they became automatic. But German military culture emphasized following doctrine and executing orders exactly as given. Innovation came from the top down, from experienced officers and doctrine writers, not from individual tank commanders making battlefield decisions. American training encouraged what would later be called mission command, giving crews clear objectives but allowing flexibility in execution. Tank commanders were taught to assess situations and adapt tactics, rather than following rigid procedures. This cultural difference made American units more capable of exploiting the fire while moving capability, because individual commanders felt empowered to try new approaches. The practice of firing while moving wasn't officially mandated from high command initially. It emerged organically as individual crews and units experimented with their stabilizers and discovered the technique's effectiveness. Company commanders noticed which crews were achieving better results and spread those techniques through their units. Battalion commanders observed which companies were more successful and adjusted training emphasis accordingly. By mid-1944, this bottom-up innovation had percolated through the entire armored force and been incorporated into formal training programs. New crews arriving in Europe had already practiced mobility fire extensively, but the technique had been discovered and refined by combat veterans who figured it out through trial, error, and survival. The 5-man crew structure of the Sherman facilitated this innovation. Each crew member had clearly defined responsibilities, but also needed to work as a tightly coordinated team. The intercom system allowed constant communication. A good crew developed almost telepathic coordination, where the driver anticipated the gunner's needs, the loader worked in rhythm with the gunner's firing sequence, and the commander orchestrated everything while maintaining situational awareness. Crew continuity mattered enormously. A crew that trained together, deployed together, and fought together for months developed capabilities that newly assembled crews couldn't match. They learned each other's tendencies, developed shorthand communication, and built the trust necessary to execute complex maneuvers under fire. Staff Sergeant Robert Early of the 2nd Armored Division described this crew synergy in a post-war interview. After a few months together, we didn't need to say much on the intercom. I'd spot a target and my gunner was already traversing before I finished calling it out. My driver knew when to speed up or slow down without being told. We functioned like one organism, not 5 separate guys in a steel box. This crew cohesion was maintained through the American replacement system usually. When casualties occurred, American policy aimed to replace individual crewmen rather than breaking up surviving crew members and reassigning them. A tank that lost a loader would get a new loader, keeping the experienced commander, gunner, driver, and assistant driver together. This preserved accumulated experience and crew coordination. The Germans, facing manpower shortages by 1944, often couldn't maintain this crew continuity. Surviving crew members from destroyed tanks might be reassigned individually to different units. The institutional knowledge and team coordination that made units effective gradually eroded. The psychological aspect of firing while moving cannot be understated. For a gunner, it required confidence bordering on aggression. You had to trust that the stabilizer would work, trust your ability to track a bouncing target, and accept that your first shot might miss. German gunners were trained to make that first shot count. Missing was considered a failure of skill. American gunners were trained to get rounds downrange quickly and adjust fire. This psychological difference reflected broader cultural attitudes. German military culture valued precision, discipline, and technical perfection. American culture valued pragmatism, improvisation, and good-enough solutions delivered quickly. Neither approach was inherently superior, but in the specific context of mobile armored warfare with roughly equal forces, the American approach proved more effective. The tank commander's role was particularly demanding when employing mobility fire. He had to identify targets while the tank was moving, estimate range while bouncing around, decide instantly whether to fire on the move or halt, and maintain awareness of terrain, friendly positions, and multiple potential threats simultaneously. Lieutenant Colonel Albin Irzik, commanding 8th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, developed specific training methods for his tank commanders. He emphasized what he called combat vision, the ability to rapidly process multiple visual inputs and prioritize threats. His commanders practiced identifying vehicle types at a glance, estimating ranges by terrain association, and making rapid engagement decisions. Irzik's battalion achieved exceptional combat effectiveness during the advance across France and into Germany. His units consistently achieved favorable kill ratios and completed missions ahead of schedule. Post-war analysis attributed much of this success to superior small unit leadership and crew training rather than equipment advantages. The physical demands on crews practicing mobility fire were substantial. The gunner had to maintain his position against the gun sight while the tank pitched and rolled, keeping his eye to the rubber eyepiece for extended periods. This caused severe eye strain and headaches. Experienced gunners learned to relax their facial muscles and ride with the motion rather than fighting against it. The loader had perhaps the most physically punishing job, loading 35-pound 76mm shells, while the tank bounced over rough terrain required strength, timing, and spatial awareness. Loaders developed techniques for bracing themselves, anticipating the tank's motion, and placing shells precisely into the breech even during violent movement. A good loader could maintain a firing rate of 8 to 10 rounds per minute, even while moving cross-country. The driver's contribution to effective mobility fire was often underappreciated. A skilled driver could maintain steady speed and choose the smoothest path, significantly improving the gunner's hit probability. Experienced drivers learned to read terrain ahead, picking routes that minimized vertical movement even if they weren't the most direct path to the objective. Technical maintenance of the stabilizer system was critical, and often challenging. The Westinghouse gyrostabilizer was a complex electromechanical device requiring precise calibration. The gyroscope had to spin at exactly the correct speed. The hydraulic actuators needed proper fluid pressure. The electrical connections had to remain secure despite constant vibration. Crew-level maintenance couldn't fix major stabilizer problems that required depot-level service. But crews learned to perform basic troubleshooting and adjustments. They kept spare fuses, cleaned electrical contacts, checked hydraulic fluid levels, and recalibrated the system when possible. Tank crews who maintained their stabilizers properly had a significant advantage over crews who let the system deteriorate. American logistics supported this maintenance emphasis. Spare parts were usually available. Maintenance manuals were written in clear language rather than overly technical jargon. Technical representatives from Westinghouse sometimes visited frontline units to provide specialized maintenance training. This comprehensive support structure kept stabilizers operational at much higher rates than would otherwise have been possible. The contrast with German tank maintenance illustrates the American advantage in practical support. German tanks were mechanically complex and required specialized tools and highly trained mechanics. As the war progressed and Germany's industrial capacity degraded, maintenance became increasingly difficult. Tanks were abandoned for relatively minor mechanical issues because proper repair was impossible in field conditions. Sherman tanks, while not invulnerable to breakdown, were designed for field maintenance. Components were relatively accessible. Repair procedures were standardized. Replacement parts were interchangeable between tanks. The entire logistics system was built around keeping the maximum number of tanks operational. This maintenance advantage directly enabled the fire-while-moving doctrine. A sophisticated capability like gyrostabilized fire control only works if the equipment remains functional. American maintenance practices kept stabilizers working, allowing crews to rely on them in combat. Training also addressed the mental challenge of aggressive tactics. Firing while moving and advancing under fire required crews to overcome natural self-preservation instincts. The human tendency when being shot at is to stop, seek cover, and assess the situation. American training conditioned crews to do the opposite: accelerate, return fire immediately, and close with the enemy. This conditioning happened through realistic training that gradually increased stress levels. Early training used static ranges with no time pressure. Intermediate training introduced time limits and scoring pressure. Advanced training used moving targets, simulated enemy fire, and complex scenarios requiring rapid decision-making. By the time crews deployed to combat, they had internalized the aggressive response. When a target appeared, the trained reaction was to engage immediately while moving, not to halt and take careful aim. This conditioned response gave American crews the critical seconds of advantage that often determined engagement outcomes. The learning curve continued in combat. Veterans who survived their first several engagements developed refined skills that no training program could fully replicate. They learned to read tactical situations at a glance, anticipate enemy actions, and execute mobility fire under the extreme stress of actual combat. Units rotated experienced crews to training duties when possible, spreading combat-proven techniques to replacement crews. A veteran gunner could demonstrate subtleties of tracking technique that were difficult to describe in words. An experienced tank commander could explain how to assess whether to fire on the move or halt based on dozens of tactical variables. This informal knowledge transfer supplemented formal training and kept Americans' armored units improving throughout the war. Each generation of crews learned from the previous generation's experience. Techniques were constantly refined based on what worked in actual combat. The American approach also benefited from a more egalitarian military culture than existed in most armies of the era. American officers and enlisted men came from similar backgrounds and shared common cultural references. Social distance between officers and enlisted personnel was less rigid than in European armies. This facilitated better communication and allowed good ideas to flow upward through the chain of command. A sergeant who discovered an effective technique could bring it to his lieutenant's attention without breaching social protocols. The lieutenant could implement it and share it with the company commander. The company commander could spread it through the battalion. This open communication accelerated tactical innovation. The fire-while-moving doctrine ultimately succeeded because it aligned technical capability, tactical doctrine, training methodology, crew skills, maintenance support, and organizational culture. Remove any one of these elements, and the system would have been less effective. The Americans had the technical capability through the gyrostabilizer. They developed tactical doctrine through bottom-up innovation. They implemented comprehensive training that instilled both technical skills and aggressive mindset. They maintained crew continuity that built team coordination. They provided logistics support that kept equipment operational. And they fostered organizational culture that encouraged initiative and adaptation. When all these elements came together in a Sherman tank crew facing German armor in 1944–45, the result was a weapons system that performed far better than its technical specifications suggested it should. The tank that could fire while moving wasn't just a machine with a stabilizer. It was a complete integration of technology, tactics, training, and human factors that created capabilities exceeding the sum of its parts. This holistic approach to weapons system development, recognizing that human factors and organizational culture matter as much as hardware specifications, became a lasting legacy of American military development. The lesson that the Americans learned and the Germans never quite grasped was that the best weapon isn't necessarily the most technically advanced weapon. The best weapon is the one that can be produced in adequate numbers, maintained in field conditions, employed effectively by trained crews, and supported by logistics and doctrine that maximize its practical capabilities. The Sherman crews who killed Tigers and Panthers while rolling forward at 15 miles per hour proved that warfare is won by complete systems, not by individual components. Their innovation in mobility fire represented not just a clever tactic, but a fundamental understanding of how to integrate all elements of combat power into effective action.